Prussack, physical therapist from the Pain PT, and I actually have a special guest here today, Eddy Lindenstein from the Mind and Fitness Podcast. Eddy, how are you today?
I'm good, Jim. What's going on? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you've had me on your podcast a couple of times, and I so appreciate it, and been super stoked to share some information. And I kind of want to reverse the tables today with you and just kind of talk to you a bit about your experience, your journey. And I think that might shed some light for people, because you're always talking to people, you're always getting a lot of information from people. But I want to hear more about yourself and how you came to this, to where you are now with this awesome podcast.
Yeah, so it turns out that my story goes back a lot further than sort of the meat and potatoes of it, which is I can't remember who it was. Somebody had said on my show, I don't know, a year ago or something like that, where they had referred to their point of needing to go and find an alternative in terms of medicine, mind-body work, as being the point where their pain got so bad they couldn't ignore it anymore. And so I didn't have like recurring pains that, like, I wasn't in agony for a long, it wasn't a 30-year kind of thing. But once I found a lot of this type of work, I did go back and eventually make basically like a symptom list of when did a symptom start and then what was going on in my life. And I had found that, in fact, this stuff does go back a long time. But the biggest part of it to me is like kind of that 2015, 2016, 2017 part. Basically, I do weightlifting training. You can see the plates and the barbells and such in the back.
Love the man cave there.
Yeah.
Man cave.
Yeah, it's a sign from my mom, and then the one, you can't see it very well, but the one beside it says work less, ride more, because I'm an avid motorcycle rider too, which maybe we'll get into at some point. But basically, I was training in weightlifting for a competition. This is at the end of 2015, and I was doing a snatch, which, if you're not familiar with Olympic weightlifting, a snatch is one fluid movement of a barbell from the ground to overhead. And I was going for a max attempt, but it wasn't anything crazy. It was 2.2 pounds more than what I had lifted my best previously. So it wasn't like I was making a massive jump. And the barbell just kind of caught a little bit further behind than I was used to. And I made the lift, I dropped the bar. I kind of felt a little bit off. I went over and did a couple of stretches and then proceeded to do my clean and jerks. And I clean and jerked 235 pounds or something like that day. So I kind of figured I was fine. I was really sore that evening with my shoulder and such. And I had the lift on video. And as I would show it to some people, someone had suggested, it was a chiropractor, that I may have had a subluxation and that's what I was feeling. And didn't really know what that was, but I guess it's like a minor dislocation, not a, just basically like a quick of the ball out of the socket kind of thing. And the thought was that I'll be fine here pretty quickly. So I took 5 days off from doing anything, started lifting again, really light, like 50% of my best, or maybe even less than that. And basically anytime I would get to 70% or so, I would start to have recurring pains again. And it would be pretty consistent pattern of being kind of like the ball on my shoulder, but also sometimes going all the way down the arm into the pinky and such. And so it took 3 months before I could get a surgeon to write me up for an MRI, like actually approve an MRI. Finally had it, and I was diagnosed with a Hegel lesion at first. So the humeral, something like that. Long acronym. So had that.
Scary medical words.
Right, yeah. Well, and then even scarier when you look up what that thing even is. And because it was like a Hill-Sachs fracture, a Hegel lesion. But then I wanted to get a second opinion before I just signed up and did surgery with this surgeon, even though she seemed very competent. And then I was diagnosed with a labral tear, and then somebody else diagnosed me with a labral tear and a rotator cuff tear, and they were all looking at the same imaging. And I was just kind of perplexed, because I always assumed that physical medicine was one of those things where it is or it is not. And if you're looking at a picture of something, most people, if I was looking at a picture of you right now, I could say, Jim, your shirt is blue. If somebody else walked in and said, Jim, your shirt is red, that wouldn't make sense to me. So basically,
because the medical profession wants black or white, but
right.
We know there's so many shades of gray, and so this is the problem,
And ironically, on an MRI, if you've ever seen an MRI scan, particularly an arthrogram, there's a lot of gray, so pun intended. So I ended up having surgery a few months later. This was in April of 2016, and they ended up fine. They gave me all the pictures afterwards. They repaired my labrum, so I had a Bankart lesion, which for anybody that doesn't know, it's the under part of the armpit basically was torn. It was like 110 degrees all the way up here to the front. And then I also had a rotator cuff tear, which they had just did some debriding on. And then they had said the Hill-Sachs fracture would heal on its own, and I'm not really worried about that. So I was in a sling for 6 weeks, and I mean, they were giving me all these warnings ahead of time. You're going to have this amount of pain right afterwards. You're going to need to stay on painkiller, because I've never smoked a cigarette. I don't drink all that often. I've never done drugs. So to tell me I'm going to go on Oxycontin for 7 days or 10 days or whatever, it's kind of daunting. But after 2-3 days, I was pain free. I was icing a lot, but started going to physical therapy at 1 week. And I remember they said this is probably 8 to 10 months before you're going to be cleared for all activity. And that summer I was just like a rehab machine. So I would do 2 sessions at home a day, and sometimes I go meet with my physical therapist. I'd see him 2 or 3 times a week, and eventually we're getting into what's that?
You were one of those perfect patients we really like that actually do their homework.
I asked him how many because he was kind of surprised how quickly I was making progress and how far we could get active range of motion without me having any pain. And I had asked him, well, what's the amount of patients that go through, do all the work of having a surgery and then don't do any of the rehab, or they slack off on it? And he told me, you'd be surprised that it's actually a really high number. And I'm just thinking, there's no way that I'm going to do all this work to go back to weightlifting and not do the work that's necessary to get me back to my sport. Beginning of August to mid-August, so I had been rehabbing at this point for about 4 months, a little under 4 months, and the doctor started to tell me, hey, you're making really amazing progress, and I think that you'll probably actually be cleared for all activity in early September, and which was going to be, that was going to be 3 to 5 months ahead of what I was expecting. And it was strange because then there was some stuff that had gone on at work right around this time, so it was kind of like my career was kind of taking a little bit of a hit, but I felt I'm going to get my shoulder back and I'm going to be able to do the things that I love, so I'm not confined into a job that I'm not all that satisfied with and a life that I'm not all that satisfied with. And so, but like, I don't know, mid-August, just a few weeks before I was going to be cleared, I started developing knee tendonitis. And I'd been squatting a lot, so it made logical sense to me that knee tendonitis is just something you get. Went to the doctor. He gave me some anti-inflammatories. A week or so later, I didn't have pain anymore. The next day...
Have you had any knee problems prior to that, or was it the first time you really had some?
Usually like 3-4 times a year, I would have some kind of a tendonitis-ish overuse kind of a feel. Weightlifters, they squat 3, 4, 5 times a week. And weightlifting, 2 words, is different than weightlifting, which is 1 word. So in the sport of weightlifting, we train the snatch, the clean and jerk, and squats, and that's all really that we do, aside from some accessory movement. So I would squat 3, 4, 5 times a week, really heavy, and so that was just my expectation. This is what tendonitis is what you get. And tendonitis goes away. The day after the tendonitis goes away, I had my first really scary out of nowhere symptom, which was sciatica. And my wife and I have season tickets to the University of Washington Huskies football team, and we would have to walk because I'm cheap. I don't want to pay $20, $40 for parking or whatever it is. Yeah. So we have this far walk to get to the stadium, and I'm like dragging my leg, and it is just like agony. Like it feels like it's 40 pounds, and I have the electrical feeling, and really freaked me out.
This is all pre-TMS PPD. You didn't really know much about this at all at this point, right?
I'd never heard anything about it.
Yeah.
So I basically, this goes on for a couple of days. I was starting to Google, what is it that even causes something like this? And it was either herniated disc, bulging disc, or a tight piriformis. And so it's well, let's do the easiest thing first. So I did some piriformis stretches. It goes away pretty quickly, within a day or 2 of doing these stretches. And then the cleared for all activity day was a Wednesday, scheduled to be a Wednesday, September 7, 2016. Perfect TMS mind. I remember the date. And I was at the gym. I was at my CrossFit gym, and it was the first time that I had tried to do pull-ups in a conditioning, a high-intensity interval training type workout. And I remember before I looked up at the bar, I just said, Eddie, don't mess this up. You just spent all this time rehabbing this shoulder. So I jump up to the bar, I retract my shoulder.
Pressure that you had at that moment in time, right?
Yeah, external and internal. And so I pinned my shoulder blades back because I was trying to really get my lats nice and beefed up because it had been so long since I'd done any of that. Pin them back, jump up on the bar. I do the, I don't know, it was like 5 rounds of 7 or something like that, or maybe it was even like 7 rounds of 5. This was using assistance bands, so it was like I was getting help too.
Yeah.
And I hopped off the bar, and I remember it was basically like I did that shoulder retraction, scapular depression and retraction, and it was like they never let go. And it was a really strange feeling, like they never let go. And the erectors on both sides of my spine were massive. They looked like, I mean, I've got this big steel water bottle. They looked like this on both sides, big pythons
on each side of your spine.
Yeah, and it was just, I just couldn't, like I was locked up, and I never experienced anything like that before. Went home and called a chiropractor's office that was close to us that was recommended. Went and saw him. So this is the first time that I went and saw like a chiropractor for a back problem. The one that I saw for my shoulder was just because he was a friend of mine, and
you had no symptoms of this at all until you went to the gym that day. Is that right?
In the gym today, right? I go in and I was just freaked out. I had a labral tear. Even though I had back issues, I started to get numbness into my hands as well. Mostly into like pinky finger, ring finger. It was just like I'd be riding my motorcycle and I would just something didn't feel like right at all. And went and saw him. He did, typical chiropractor thing, cracked my back, took the big the big gun thing that they use now to warm up the tissue. And I went home that night and like flu-like symptoms. Like I never experienced feeling that terrible, throwing up like all night. And I was just thinking like, what happened? How could it have caused? And then I start Googling again, and some people talk about adverse reactions to having their first chiropractor visit, and it's the toxins getting flushed from your body, and it's basically like a withdrawal. And again, I've never done drugs, so I don't know what a withdrawal feels like. So basically so this is September of 2016. I then spent the following 8 months where I probably every week would spend 1 day in a doctor's office, 1 day in a chiropractor's office, 1 day in a massage therapist's office, just trying to the tension that was in my mid back, the tension that was in my upper back, the numbing that was I'd be at work and I'd type on the keyboard and my hands would go numb and all this kind of stuff.
You had none of that original type pain.
No.
Right. So you went to the gym and did this workout, which you talked about being a big deal. And all of a sudden your back locks up, all this stuff. But the original pain that you had surgery for wasn't there. You had all this other stuff going on.
Right. Exactly. And I was very body conscious because a lot of the PT work that I had to do was doing the TheraBand exercises. They would tell me that you'd have to have shoulder blades back and down, no using your trap, so you're very, very in tune with all the little musculature, especially in the trunk, throughout all of this. And so every little ache and pain, even in the rehab process, which was pretty well without speed bumps, if I did have a little ache and pain, I was so attuned to it, and it would really frustrate me if I had something happen.
I think that you had a little bit of that hypervigilance sort of because of all the things you've been through. And
definitely. Yeah. So eventually, a few months after this happened, I finally got in to see the guy who did my surgery. This was in February of the next year. Who did my shoulder surgery. Seahawks season was over, so he was done working with them. And I went in, and I remember it was he spent 10 seconds. He looked at the basically wanted to see the range of motion on my shoulder to see if the labrum was retorn. And then he just said, "This is coming from your neck, and here's some referrals," and that was it. And I never had a neck problem, and that really freaked me out because I was thinking, the nerve issues I had in my leg not too long ago. He's saying it's in the neck, and that might have been in the lower back, so maybe it's the whole spine. And it just started to become so bad that I remember I went to a chiropractor, and he would prescribe to me, it'd be 4 sets of PT exercises 14 times a day. So I would go to the bathroom to work.
Yes.
What's that?
I never heard that 14 times a day.
He'd say basically every hour to hour and a half that I was awake, that I had to go and do something. So, and he said, in 6 weeks, you'll be better. So I'd go and see him 3 times a week for 6 weeks. And then return to his office. When we get to the end of the 6 weeks and nothing was different, he said that I wasn't doing the exercises that. Oh, so you're slacking off and you're not doing them. And, you need to take this stuff seriously. And he's like, your brachial plexus is compressed, and that's the issue. And you need to pay. This could be really, really bad, and your circulation's bad, and it's just like a lot of like fear mongering. And then finally,
those messages coming back at you again after you did all that work, and him telling you, right, setting up the expectation you're going to be better in this amount of time. You're working really hard, you don't get better. Then he just tells you, oh, now you got this.
Right.
That's even adding more, right? More to this whole picture.
Right. And that was like the first time that I was diagnosed with thoracic outlet syndrome. And then a couple other doctors also diagnosed me with it. And when I look at like success rates of people going and having surgery for this and getting their scalenes removed and their pec minors removed, like was being recommended to me, like the success rates were like 20%. And I just thought like, all right, well, this is it. Now that time by this point, I was 6 months out of the gym. I had quit completely. And I said, until somebody fixes me, I'm not going to lift a barbell anymore. So I'd been resorted to just coming home, and I might do some yoga, but very minimally. Mostly it was just taking walks, and that was about it. Just didn't have the energy.
What was your fear factor like at that time about doing certain things?
My neck was on fire all the time, and if I touched a barbell, like, because this chiropractor that I worked with for a month and a half, he would say, like, if you do push-ups, your neck's going to be tense, and it's going to seize up your nerves, and you may not be able to use your arms again. So like it was
terrible message.
It was like anything I could do. He said, like, your core is so weak, and so your whole body is relying on your neck, and that's where you have all the problems anyway. So it was just so much of that. He had great reviews, still does to this day. But the reviews are all people that say, I've been seeing Dr. Lee for 4 years, and I'm just thinking, like, 4 years, like, that's crazy. So all this research about nerve problems and all that, I found this guy who did this procedure called a hydrodissection. And what that is they identify nerves in the body that may have problems with either like fascia tissue that's scarred over onto it that are pinching the nerve. So I traveled all the way to Montana, which was a 14-hour drive each way. And on successive days, I had procedures done on my neck to untrap my nerves. So he showed me on imaging, live imaging, and this was all out of network, so I paid out of pocket for all of this, which is an enormous amount of money that, like, just, stupid money. And which I paid cash for, so kids, if you're watching that,
you wanted to get better, right?
Right.
This is what people do. I mean, it's not abnormal, really, but looking back on it now,
right.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So, he showed me, like, he said I have an accessory scalene. He's like, only 5% of the population even has this. And so that's part of the problem. It's shrinking that nerve bundle, which is causing these issues. And it's like the median nerve has a problem. The long thoracic nerve has a problem. Your serratus anterior is paralyzed. Like, so it was, again, just a lot of this message. However, he did say that, this is something that you likely will get better from, by letting me do this procedure and then having some physical therapy and like saying that it will get better. It didn't get better. In fact, the drive home was miserable. And eventually there was a really popular story on the news around here. I'm up in Seattle, of this doctor, the University of Washington Huskies football team, who I would see on the sidelines when I was there. Very tall woman. She looks like she's about 7 feet from the stands, which is probably 5'10" or something like that. Dr. Kimberly Harmon, and she was in the news because 2 chimpanzees got in a fight at the local zoo, and they asked her to come and evaluate their ACL tears, or what they thought was ACL tears. And she had said, like, these injuries that they have can just be splinted. They don't need to be, surgically done. And that really jumped out at me because I had thought, like, okay, here's a surgeon or a doctor who's working with athletes and is saying that surgery is not necessary in a lot of cases. And so went and saw her. She was the first doctor who spent a lot of time with me. So she reviewed my EMGs, which revealed a lot of nerve issues, my MRI, my neck, looked at all the imaging before my shoulder surgery, after my shoulder surgery, spent probably an hour to an hour and a half with me, which she was very in high demand here. Analyzes she does strength tests, she does movement tests, she does all this stuff. And she just really seriously goes, and it's crazy because I just heard Dr. Schubiner say this exact phrase, and it really struck me. She said, "Tell me what's going on in your life." And what I thought that meant was, tell me about all the physical stuff that you do. I was like, well, I want to be a weightlifter, but I haven't trained in a while. And she's like, tell me about your job. You said you had a kid. What do you do for a living? Are you married? Do you have a house? Like, it was all this stuff that I'd never been asked before. And, I answered it. And she started explaining about stress manifestations in the body. And actually was the first person to suggest that I talk to a sports psychologist when I had left. And I was like, didn't make any sense to me. But she had said, if you think about like a top level NCAA receiver or any high level athlete, if they're used to performing a certain way, and then they go out and they have a game where they've got, 2 catches for 15 yards and no touchdowns, like the amount of rehabilitation that we have to do with the mind to really get them to be able to perform at their best, or could cause a manifestation of musculoskeletal symptoms. And so she's like, that's what I think is going on, and that's my opinion. And I kind of went home for a few weeks and didn't really think much of it.
What did you think of it at the time, because you respected her, obviously, and from her work, and she spent a lot of time with you. She asked you the thorough examination, and she gives you this information which was completely different from what you were hearing before. What happened at the time? Did you believe it, or were you kind of like, I'm not sure about this?
I was under the belief of which a lot of the people in my inner circle are, which, stress can manifest. It basically, stress is the exclamation point at the end of a really loud sentence. So the structural injury is the loud sentence, and then the exclamation point is the stress. Meaning, I probably do have a terrible problem that's going to have pain, and I'm going to need it corrected somehow. But the stress side of it that she's talking about is just making it a little worse. Like, that's what I thought. Called my wife on the way home. She was like, "Oh, that's weird." And so I ended up finding I was on Amazon a couple weeks later, and I was looking at like foam rollers or something like that. And it had a suggested purchase of Healing Back Pain by Dr. Sarno. And I read the reviews, and I looked and saw that he had 4 books. I added up the reviews. There's like 3,000 or 4,000 reviews, and it's like an average of 4.8 out of 5 stars. And I'm just reading these, and it's just, it's miles long. I had herniated discs. I had a failed back surgery 20 years ago. I had fibromyalgia for 15 years. I was in a terrible car accident. Like, there was all these people talking about these terrible things that were pain-free after participating in it. So I then went and checked my insurance, looked to see what psychologists in my area were covered. Found this guy, Dr. Terry Copeland, who was 3 miles from my house, the only male who was covered by my insurance. So went and talked to him. I brought up, when he asked, what do you want to be seen about? I said, stress and anxiety, just off of what that doctor told me. And he said, okay. So I came in, I started talking about Sarno to him, and to my luck, he knew all about Sarno and totally believed in it, which is, as I found out, was rare for a psychologist.
Yeah, the stars really aligned, didn't they?
Yeah. So I saw
that doctor, right? Washington Huskies doctor. That's what the turning point.
Yep. Yeah, and we've been in communication since then, and I've let her know how grateful I was. And if I've written an article where I talk about these things, I send it to her. When I interviewed Dr. Schechter, I sent her that interview. So it's that's been, and someday I'll get around to doing an interview with her. She said she's totally willing to be on the podcast, and I think it'd be pretty wild because she's not a mind body. She's not Schubiner, she's not Schechter. She does surgery, she does procedures, but at the same time, she took a guy who everybody else said needed a surgery and said, no, this is in the mind, and like that's pretty powerful.
Absolutely. So you went and saw the psychologist, and carry on. How long did you see him for, and what came out of that?
I saw him for like 8 months, and then he retired. He was 73 years old at the time that I started seeing him, but it was as if we were brothers. We both rode motorcycles. We were into a lot of the same stuff. At that time when I first saw him, I still had, as I've learned later, guard was up a little bit still. Like I am the perfect dad, I'm the perfect sales guy, all that kind of stuff. He helped me break down a lot of that stuff, but I wish that I could still see him now, because I think that the way that I see myself and the vulnerability to which I put out there is so much greater. And even like my wife and I it's one of the most attractive, like sexiest things that my wife does. When we do this together, we're like, the other day we sent a text, our 5-year-old was very problematic last week. It was her birthday, staying up late every day, 4th of July, a lot of sweets, all this kind of stuff. And she was just kind of not being herself. And, I was just like, God, is this what happens at 5? I was so close to her, all this kind of stuff. And we would send these text messages to each other. And I remember I sent it the other day and I said, hey, like, I feel really bad. I yelled at Zoe the other day, and it broke my heart when she turned around to me and said, Dad, stop yelling at me. And Jenny says back to me, it's just stuff we need to be aware of. She's like, I yelled at her 2 weeks ago and I felt so terrible. And all this kind of, it's just not like, it's a thing that you think that couples would talk about, but not a lot of couples do say, here's my faults as a parent, and we're co-parenting and we're having those kind of issues. So I just wish I could still see Dr. Copeland today, but he's retired, and I'm sure he's riding his motorcycle every day, and I'm jealous of that.
So at that time you had read, which book did you get? So you read one of Dr. Sarno's books at this time, and then you started seeing the psychologist. Is that right?
Yeah, so I read Healing Back Pain, and I saw like a good 30% cessation of symptoms right away in the first day.
By reading the book. Yeah.
Yep, just reading the book. And then without his prompt, and Shubin I later learned has patients do this, but I started making a symptom list of when did the symptom occur and when, what was going on in my life. And I'd said earlier, I got that tendonitis issue 3 or 4 times a year. So I had found that I'm a salesman, and I would have the end of my quarters, which would be end of March, end of June, end of September, end of December. And when I made the symptom list, 100% of the time, every tendonitis issue, every stomach issue, every allergic reaction, every bad asthma attack, like anything really health issue that I had fell in one of those 4 months. So it was always at the end of a quarter in the last 2 weeks of the quarter. And that, I think, for me was the biggest aha of anything, is that there's no way over an 8-year period that's just a coincidence. And I would look back even further and say the acid reflux I got in 2007, right when I turned 21, was when I had my first internship in college. I was commuting 200 miles a day to do that. I looked back even further. Nosebleeds, when did they start? What was going on? Like frequent urination, what was going on? Like, so it really is a long pattern that just gradually got worse and worse, and those pull-ups just happen to be the straw that broke the camel.
You look back on it now, it's pretty clear to you, right, that, oh, wow, I had these symptoms right around periods of stress or periods of increased tension in yourself. But at the time, did you notice that you were feeling these things or feeling the stress or tension, or you didn't really put it together that you were even experiencing that?
I just thought bad luck. That's all it is. And I mean, now there's even been a couple instances in the last couple of weeks where I've been thinking like, oh yeah, like I was in such bad knee pain that I had a girlfriend in the beginning of 2006 I went to break up with her. She told me she was pregnant. Pregnancy ended up not even being real, fake pregnancy. And my knee was in such horrible pain. I literally was wearing one of those knee braces where you lock it at a certain percentage because it hurts so bad. And that just came to me the other day, and I was thinking, man, this is Howard Stern says that Sarno's work and this kind of stuff is the mother lode. And I'm starting to read a book by Dr. Mate, Gabor Mate, which I had not before, and he gets into MS, and he gets into a lot of stuff that's even deeper than the Sarno work.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, I see it a lot too, where people just can't really connect the dots at first. It's like, it's not even clear at all or on their radar, right? But like you said, when you finally broke it down, you went back and looked at the pattern of things, it was quite clear, quite obvious. And sometimes, like you said, oh, I don't feel stress, or maybe it doesn't even seem to your conscious mind that it's a big deal what's happening, but your body speaks the truth, doesn't it?
I think that's part of why when Dr. Harmon said that, and I thought this is just the exclamation point to a problem that does exist. Because it is like, I did not see myself as a stressful person, because when I think of a stressful person, I think of the sales guy who comes in the house and kicks the dog and throws his briefcase down and is always yelling and always upset. Like, that's what I think of when I think of a stressed out, angry person. And little did I know that, yes, that is a stressed out, angry person. But it's not repression, right? It's the whole different bag of worms. I didn't know repression existed. It's not a lot. I took 55 credits, so more than enough for a minor. Psychology. We didn't talk about any of this stuff. We talked about Freud for 6 weeks. None of this stuff I knew about.
Yeah, and it's so, I think because when you talk about repression, Dr. Sarno says it's unconscious. We're not aware that we're doing it. And sometimes our patterns are such that this is who we are. So we can't see in ourselves that we're actually doing that. And we see somebody else, like you said, just expressing and kind of exploding. Oh yeah, they must be stressed out. Well, I'm not really stressed out.
Yeah.
And so it's like hard to see the reflection of ourselves sometimes. But typically the people that aren't doing that, throwing things around, expressing themselves, they're the ones who get the TMS, right? They get this PPD in the first place.
Right. Certainly.
Carry on with your story. So the psychologist, you went and saw him, he helped you a bit. And then from that point forward, what happened after that?
So when Sarno had said in his book, and I think he evolved this, I think in later books he said, in terms of getting back to activity, he had said wait until the symptoms have almost subsided and then go back to activity. But in healing back pain, he was still of the, and this is what I prescribe when people ask me what to do, because I'm a big believer in the maximum physical activity possible. And so I just feel like if that thing is too heavy for you, you're not going to be able to lift it up. And that's a lot of the examples that Sarno used early on. So I'm a big believer as a salesperson in the more money that you spend on something, just the more bought in you are to that concept. Our biggest purchase is our house. For the most part, people will take good care of their house, good care of their nice car, good care of, whatever. And so CrossFit gyms are ridiculously expensive. Like mine's a couple $100 a month. So what I thought was like, okay, I need to be vested. I need to be bought in. If he says get back to max activity, I haven't touched a barbell in 6 months. So I went down to the gym that I'd gone to before the shoulder injury, and I prepaid for 3 months, like right then and there. And I went 5 days a week, every week, still to this day, of hard weightlifting training, hard CrossFit training. 6 a.m. I'm in there. I'm, yesterday I was doing clean and jerk triples, meaning no rest, no breaks at 235, 240 pounds. At this point, I can squat over 330, 340, something like that. I can deadlift almost 400 and snatch 200 and clean and jerk 275. So I'm stronger than I ever was. And it's hard to believe because there was a period of time to which I had all my stuff that you see behind me on Craigslist. I had my motorcycles on Craigslist. I'd given up motorcycling, I'd given up weightlifting, I'd given up CrossFit. But I think diving back in is necessary.
Yeah, so you're ready to pack it in, and instead, after kind of getting that sort of understanding and aha moment, it sounds like you just dove right back in. You didn't even take it in a slow way, right? Is that right? You just kind of literally jumped back in and went hard at it from the beginning once you had this understanding and mindset. Is that right?
Yeah, and maybe that's part of it, because I didn't have the worst of my chronic symptoms leave me for a good year and a half after finding this stuff, because it was like the asthma still lingered a little bit, and the food allergy stuff still lingered a little bit. But with those things, it was the same approach that I took with the gym. So like allergies and asthma, I'd been taking a cocktail of 4 prescription medicines every day since 2011, and even as a kid, I took them all the time. One day I just came home, it was August of last year, and I just said, like, I'm done. So I just stopped taking them cold turkey. There was no, we're going to slowly get off this stuff. Like, I threw my inhaler in the garbage and I stopped taking all the pills. I didn't have any change in performance. I didn't get the asthma or the exercise-induced asthma. It just didn't happen anymore. And then the food allergy, again, this goes back to the symptom list. I have always loved dairy. I'm an ice cream guy. That's probably why I have to work out so hard to maintain a physique, because I love ice cream. And so ate it every day, no problems at all. And then suddenly, September of 2013, I just developed this dairy allergy. I would get bloated. That's where the IBS stuff started. And I just thought, like, I remember I talked to a dietitian, and she said that you've got leaky gut. And so, you need to avoid dairy, you need to avoid gluten, you need to avoid all that other stuff. So I went on a paleo diet pretty much. But dairy just always freaked me out. That's the exact same thing. I did one day, I'm like, I'm doing it. And just started having whey protein again and having cheese on a hamburger and eating ice cream and all that kind of stuff. And nothing happened. Like, it was crazy.
So you think that was, what do you think that was? Because that's important for other people to hear, because you had a point of literally 180-degree turn where you just said, forget it. I'm okay. I can do this. And you made a decision with confidence and then did it. And you said sometimes the symptoms might have taken a year and a half to fully go away, but you continued to just be basically normal or act normally at that point. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's this scene, the movie's terrible, but it's one of those terrible movies where I still watch it a lot. So have you ever seen Con Air with Nicolas Cage?
I haven't seen that, no.
So premise of the movie, he's a good dude who got in a bar fight trying to protect his wife, and he stabbed a guy and killed him, and he goes to jail. But he's like the good guy, the good prisoner. And there's a scene in there where he has to get hypodermic needles to a friend of his who's diabetic, and he has to go through this explosion, all this stuff's flying all over the air. The prisoners are out, like they're going to kill him if they see him. And he makes this statement where he's looking at the flames, which he's going to have to run through in order to get his needles to his buddy. And he looks at the needles and he says, well, this isn't Mai Tais and Yahtzee, but let's do it. And he runs through it. It's just like and the statement in motorcycle riding and racing and snowboarding, there's a phrase that the kids use that I picked up that's called full send or send it. You know, I'm going full send.
Yes.
That's sort of how I treat that stuff. Kind of do a risk analysis. And really it's either will I live or will I die? And if I don't take an inhaler, I'm not likely to die. I might have some uncomfortableness, right? If I have asthma and it doesn't work. If I eat the cheese or the dairy or whatever, I might have stomach issues for 4 or 5 or 6 days or whatever, but I'm not going to die. And then it turned out nothing happened. So,
yes, you move past that fear, that anxiety, to a place of confidence. It sounds like where you were empowered and said, "I know what this is now. I'm not worried anymore." Because before you would hold back, right? You said you held back. You didn't want to go to the gym or touch weights. You were just walking and kind of getting stuck in that paralyzed stage. What was the biggest thing for you think that made you turn that around? Like, what was it that made you do exactly what you just said? You just said, "I don't care anymore. I'm going to do these things because I'm normal."
I mean, just Sarno's words of saying get back to max physical activity was by far the greatest one. But then it's kind of like every day that I would go, I would do these things and nothing would happen. I remember like the first time that I went and did snatches at 60 kilos, 135 pounds. And, that's like a 75% for me. And I did it on the second day that I was back lifting without touching a barbell in 7 months and nothing happened. So it's just continuously trying something and nothing bad coming of it.
Did you have any times where, because a lot of people talk about they do go back to doing challenging things, but they do get symptom flare-ups? Did you have anything like that when on your road back?
Not with activity. No, there was one moment where I got kind of that tendonitis-ish feel, and it happened in the morning. I remember, and I back in the day when I would get this several times a year, it would last for 2 weeks, like with an anti-inflammatory. And I mean, as soon as I identified, like, oh, no, like, I'm not going to be fooled. This was really early on. I'm not going to be fooled. Like, it was gone, I don't know, like 3 hours later, like later on that night. So there's nothing with physical activity. Oddly enough, if I get any sort of a reaction, it's from like, it's in Sarno's book, he gives a lot of examples of people that will like go and have this super physical job. Construction workers, people that have physical jobs. I'm a salesman, so I don't have a physical job. But people that do, no problems, and then they get home to see their, their wife and kid or whatever, and suddenly they have symptoms. I will notice that my back will feel differently sometimes if I go and pick my kids up and my wife is out for the night and I take the kids to the park and one of them is acting insane and not, just not being herself. I will notice myself and my back feeling differently if I'm taking my sick dog to the vet to get evaluated, get his eyes checked or get his pancreas checked or something like that. Those kind of things sometimes can elicit a little bit of fear. But again, if the symptom is there and I have the recognition, one thing that therapist told me is he would always say, he didn't call it the amygdala, but that's what we're talking about. He would say the alligator. Just say, Eddie, it's the alligator. He would say, all you have to do is think about it, like step outside yourself. If you start to have a symptom, step outside yourself and say, Eddie, what's the plan and what's actually happening here? And like, a lot of times that's as simple as it is being able to say like, what's the plan? And I forgot exactly the neuroscience behind it, but it had something to do with like, instead of reacting based on what the amygdala is doing, you're really reacting on what the prefrontal cortex is doing or something like that. For the science nerds, they'll probably like that. So
That planning center of your brain, the conscious planning center, that's the prefrontal cortex. And when you activate that in a way that is rational and makes sense, it calms down that irrational amygdala emotional center of the brain. Yeah, so you kind of get that prefrontal cortex on board versus letting your amygdala run wild and keep you, stuck in that emotional cycle.
Yeah. So we're kind of doing like a Tarantino thing because I sort of skipped ahead, but the very first thing you asked was about how the podcast came to be. And I left my software job, the one that I was doing, and I said, I'm going to do fitness training because there was a period of time in my life, and maybe we'll talk about this down the road at some point, where I lost 100 pounds. And like, you never believe that Eddie was almost 250 pounds in high school, and suddenly I didn't work out. I ate Jack in the Box all the time, like that kind of thing. And
imagine that.
Right.
You're going to bring a picture out here. Steve, I didn't have a photo to show us the before and after.
So it's kind of crazy. So I don't know why you can see this tattoo, this big giant tattoo. So this is it's sideways, so it's tough to see, but it's a graveyard. And I just told the tattooist, think of the elephant graveyard in The Lion King, is what I told him. Yeah. And it says 7/22/02, so that's July 22nd, 2002. And it says RIP. And a lot of people, when they see that, they think it's like a friend of mine passed away or something like that. But that is, honest to goodness, the day where I stepped out of, my parents are teachers, and so we take summer road trips every year. It's what we did. And I get out of this car after sitting and eating cheeseburgers for 4 straight weeks, just feeling miserable. And I would have been 16 at the time. And I said, like, I stepped off the car on July 22nd and I said, that's it. Like, it's changing today. And that's how it is. And I rode my bicycle to the gym. Never had been in a gym in my life, and started working out. That time it was 2-3 hours a day, 7 days a week, which was a lot. But 1 year, 99 pounds lost. And so, it was another one of those instances where it was full send, right? I'm going right into it.
Really important, because you like your willpower, right? And not willpower, but your ability to just say, this is it. I'm making that choice and then sticking with it and going for it. That's you think that's a trait that you've always had, or you just sort of just developed that and it got even better? Every time you made a choice and you did it, you saw results and you said, okay, I can do this again.
I think that was something that probably started right around then, like the weight loss part of it. Yeah. But at the same time, that also drew an enormous amount of pressure, because every time that I would do something, it had to be better than the time before. And I talked about like that really tough time at work where kind of a lot of these health issues started. I was on the heels of being what I wanted my entire sales career, which was being the best salesperson in the company. Like, I wanted number one, chased it for years and would get as high as number 4 or 5. And then in 2015, I got the number one guy. It was all that I ever wanted, and, made a bunch of money and like had all the respect in the world and all this kind of stuff. But then the problem with being number one is what happens when you're not number one, and you do all these great things. And and so I get to that summer, where I'm rehabbing my shoulder. Not only am I dealing with the shoulder, but I'm the 14th best salesperson, which in a company of 70, 14 is pretty good.
Yeah.
But if you go from 1 to 4, if you go from 20 to 14, that's really good. If you go from 1 to 14, that's really bad. At least in my mind.
Right.
So that's another thing. Like, when did the symptoms start? What was going on? And that's a lot of stuff I talked to Dr. Harmon about when I really broke it down. Like, oh, I was the top guy. Now I'm not the top guy, and I'm not doing as well, and I just don't know what happened to me. Kind of lost my way. Like, sometimes people just don't perform as well, and it just is what it is. The rational part.
You're aware that, okay, as your performance was not dropping, you're performing well, but you dropped from 1 towards 14. Did you notice yourself getting, upset around that at the time?
Oh yeah, it was a real prick a lot. And I've talked about it in podcasts before. There's one, somebody emailed me a couple days ago on one that I put out almost 2 years ago that was called How Did My Pain Become Chronic? And I'm talking about times going out to dinner with my family and just being an asshole, because I would be getting to the end of a quarter and, maybe my knee's bugging me, but I'm also worried about making sure I close these deals, and like, I'm just so short with them and I'm very frustrated, but like, it's only coming out when the steam valve is full. So it would be like, I'd go 0 to 60 on the anger so fast. I wouldn't yell, but I would just be like, just a jerk. Like, I'm not, and I talked in this podcast a lot about not being able to like be a capable or a good husband or a good dad, and how much that bothers me looking back. But also just in the last few months, I've started to have more compassion on myself, that at that period of time, it is what it is, and it's in the past, and there's not much I can do about that. And the best I can say now, like what I'm texting my wife the other day about my daughter, about yelling at my daughter. I don't want to do it. It happened, and I'm apologizing for it, and like, the best I can do is just say I'll get better. You know what I mean? Like,
so do you think that speaks to, like, during that time, and you correlated that during a time of increased symptoms, like when you talk about these personality traits that Dr. Sarno speaks of, like putting up tremendous pressure on ourselves, striving for the best, perfectionism. Do you feel like you have some of those qualities, or had them even more during that time?
Yeah, there was like the 30 characteristics that Sarno talks about in his book. I mean, I had like 26 of them. Like, I'm not religious. There's a couple of them that you take off that I don't fit the the prototype for, but I remember I was talking to an old buddy of mine that I worked with, and he always like kind of treated me as like a mentor of his. And I remember telling him, like, he asked me how I'm doing in sales at my new job, which I'm actually doing really good, but he's like, what's your quota? And I was like, I don't know. And he said, you used to watch the numbers. He's like, you knew exactly what everything was, and you knew exactly how many calls you made, and you knew like all this. And I'm like, I'm just not even bothering paying attention to it anymore. And I'm like, because it made me miserable when I was that close to it. And he's like, you never seemed like you were. And I'm like, that's the problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem. Like, I'm like, you're one of my best friends, and I never told you that I would go home and just be freaking miserable.
Yeah, you kept that all inside, but it also speaks to the fact that you've made a big change, right? It sounds like you've really changed how you deal with things now, right? And can you speak to that, about how you feel now compared to how you felt before, just in your body, in terms of just emotionally and mentally and physically?
Just being, when I feel like, I usually use the phrase, life is getting heavy. Like when I start to feel like I'm holding a little bit too much in, or I need a little bit of a break. And so being able to actually walk in the room and tell my wife, hey, like, work's tough right now. The kids are driving me nuts. Like, I really, like, next Saturday, I want to go ride my motorcycle with my buddies for 10 hours. Like, just being able to say that, because before I wouldn't usually ask the question. And also being able to admit that parenting is hard, and being able to say that my kid is bothering me, and being able to say that she really angers me sometimes. Like, just being able to say those things. And even like our neighbors who have kids, all of our neighbors have kids, and being able to actually entrust in them, whether they think I'm nuts or they don't, which I don't think they do, but being able to say to them things that I did that are wrong, like yelling at my daughter, right? Like, or saying something to her that I feel like, God, I'm an ass for saying that. That's just that, like, we just don't admit a lot of faults. Like, the social media age, everything is a highlight reel, and I think that's fine. I think it's fine. I don't want people coming on social media and talking about how terrible their life is. But if all it is a bed of roses, and that's all that life is, and you don't confide in somebody, even if it's a piece of paper on a journal, like, that's where the problems happen. And I just, even just having, it doesn't have to be a therapist that you or I or anybody goes and talks to. It can be a piece of paper, or a spouse, or somebody who's earned the right. And sometimes that is just a piece of paper, but just like doing something.
Yeah, that's like, form of expression, right? Because for you, was it just something you learned growing up, where you just kind of held things close to the vest and wouldn't express yourself as much? Or, because you made this switch over, or did you at the time? Because some people I see don't even aware that they're kind of doing that. It's who they are, so they don't see that they're actually holding in so much and they're not expressing themselves.
Yeah, so I've given this some thought, and I'm still very close to my parents. And I was like, if my kids will be as easy of a kid as I was, like, that's going to be awesome, because, I got decent grades, but I wasn't out late. I never broke curfew. I never got a speeding ticket. I never did a drug. The teachers never called them. You know what I mean? Like, I was a good kid. However, my older sibling, just above me, did a lot of drugs, stole a lot, fought with my parents a lot. We're talking like he would pull knives, like they would get in like knockdown, drag out fights. So I watched a lot of this stuff. And I think thinking back, 20 years ago, probably a lot of me, the reason why I was so good all the time was that my brother was such a train wreck, and I don't want to put my parents through more bad stuff. So, give my mom the best Mother's Day, give my dad the best Father's Day, never be a problem, because they've dealt with too many problems. And like, that's really where I think probably the genesis of it was. So nothing that they did, it's just that's my best guess. Anyway.
Yeah. And that also speaks to, like, we talk about adverse childhood experiences, which are really important in this type of work, but it also speaks to the truth that you don't have to have trauma or severe, events happen to you, adverse events happen to you, to develop these characteristics or develop PPD or TMS, right? Because your story was a pretty good upbringing, but based on what you told me, you could see how that would develop those personality traits.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started to look into this work, because it is very like, either you're all in or you're not. I mean, that's how it should be anyway. I know a lot of people are not. Like, they're kind of riding the fence a little bit. And when I first started to look into this stuff and just trying to figure out where was the genesis of this, and I think that just talking about the nature of it and the ACE study and things like that, that like my mom, I think, was getting really offended at first because she'd be like, what was so terrible about your childhood? Because again, everything was always great between us, like my parents and I. So there was never anything that I could say that was like, you guys did this, or we fought about this, or, you know, you wouldn't let me go see my friends, or you grounded me too much. Like there was just none of that stuff because we didn't have any kind of run-ins. But, you know, like I haven't had that conversation with them ever. Like there's certain vivid memories I have of violence between a parent and my brother that I have not talked about out loud with anybody except for my wife, that I witnessed or that I saw. And like, that's not that stuff holds into me like I have PTSD or anything like that, but just these really intense moments that I'm not even going to think about rocking the boat because, you know, they just went through this horrific thing with my brother. And I remember, like a couple years ago, this was just, I think it was just after I saw Dr. Harmon, who had said, you know, stress-related stuff. After not talking to my brother for 7 or 8 years, this older brother of mine, like being totally estranged from him, he had reached out to me out of nowhere. He OD'd, his liver was like in failure, all this kind of stuff. He was in the hospital. He called me, and I hadn't heard from him since I invited him to my wedding in 2011. He said he'd come. He didn't show up. Like, so I just was like, all right, man, like, you know, we're done, whatever. We're blood, that's it. And he had told me that he was in the hospital, that he wanted to mend the fences and, you know, be the brothers that we never got to be. Asked me if I would mind helping finance his wife's car, being able to get, she needed like, you know, a new transmission, new engine, new brakes, all this kind of stuff, probably $1,000 all in. And I like did it in a heartbeat and said, man, when you get out, like, I'm so excited to like have us see each other and talk and all this kind of stuff. And I paid for it. And then I called him, and then I called him again, and I never got a call back, and I still never got a call back. Not, you know, I think he must have gotten drunk, and I started getting all these irrational, angry messages on Instagram about my wife and my kids from him. And I was just like, you know, like we're done. But when that car thing happened, my symptoms were as bad as they got. I remember like that day going on a walk with the dogs and my wife and our oldest daughter and coming home, and my traps were just so on fire. My wife was just sitting there like rubbing my upper back, and I was like just in agony, like, and that's another one, you know, symptom corresponding to what's going on. It was just crazy.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's like, you know, if you think about just when you say that story, it sounds pretty intense, and you can imagine just the amount of tension in your body, amount of stress going in. We know where stress goes, where it goes, comes either out emotionally or physically or a bit of both.
Yeah.
And so, but to be able to identify these little moments in time is so big. So with the time we got left here, Eddy, maybe I want to hear a bit more about this podcast. But before we get there, did you do anything else? So like you talked about doing what you did and it's gotten you this far. Was there anything else that you did in this TMS world, PPD world, that helped you a lot? Just so other listeners can glean this.
It seems to be that the more complicated stuff is the stuff that doesn't work for me. So like Schubiner's protocol, which I have respect for Dr. Schubiner, and we're going to interview mid-August. So, you know, like he's doing amazing things. He's doing the fMRI study at Boulder. So like, you know, we'll have a relationship, but the way that his program is laid out, where it's like an hour and a half a day of doing, like that stuff really doesn't work for me. The Nicole Sachs method of 20 minutes of journaling a day and just basically unloading on everybody in your life and acting like it's a movie and killing off all the characters, that works pretty darn well for me. Adam Heller's Zero Pain Now, where his is even shorter. He says 10 minutes of writing and then a lot of repetition of what am I feeling and actually trying to do some somatic work, like what am I feeling in my body. So I do a lot of that, like focusing on this. I call it the Stark reactor. Tony Stark, his circle thing, his arc. Yeah. So his is right there in his sternum. When I sit there for 2 minutes, I can't do it for very long. I don't think anybody can. 2 minutes of really intense, like your eyes are closed and you're just thinking about that one spot. The reason I can only do it in a couple minutes is like your attention goes elsewhere. And I think that's why everybody thinks they suck at meditation, because what am I supposed to do? Sit here and just close my eyes?
That's right.
So 2 minutes of intense focus on that. Maybe someday I'll get to 5 or 10, but now that's more my interpretation of what meditation even is. So let's just call it that, meditation. So short journaling and meditation definitely are my two greatest things right now. And I've had a lot of people message me from listeners of the podcast, and we'll get into stats in a little bit, but there's a lot of people that want private coaching with me because of the experts I've talked to, because of what I've been through, because they're ex-athletes. They've done with me. And I'm trying to think, like, what are my hottest recommendations going to be? And it's probably going to be those two.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's great information, because I think it really helped people to dig down what actually helped you, get to where you are now, because there are a lot of different spokes of the wheel, so to speak, and some help some people and some different ones help different people. So it's good to hear that from you. So let's transition in the time left to, you've got to where you are now, you recovered, and then you developed the podcast, but it started out just as a sort of a fitness podcast, right? And did that start out during the time when you were still having problems, or afterwards?
This was about a month and a half after I read Sarno's book, that I thought, like, I want to start doing like online fitness training. I started this story when I was talking about the weight loss, but my plan was I'm going to sell online workout programs at, $40 one-time purchase, something like that. The concept will be low cost of entry to people that have never worked out in their life, just like I was 15 years ago. So that's very much what it was initially based off of. And then I spent a bunch of money on a marketer who ended up totally delivering no results for a lot of money. And so I thought, okay, like, I'm going to do my own marketing thing. I don't know anything about AdWords. I don't know how to make advertisements. So why don't I do this podcast? If you look at the number of active blogs that exist in the world and on the internet versus the amount of active podcasts that exist in the internet, it's like 2%. It's a much smaller number of podcasts. So I thought this will be a much better way to try and reach people organically off of this podcast. And if people listen, they'll listen. If they don't, they don't. So the first couple episodes were just literally like, here's the workout that I do, and I would have like a CrossFit athlete on the show, and we would talk about, that. And then I just started thinking, okay, maybe we'll expand this a little bit and have a little bit more conversation about just a variety of things. It doesn't have to be fitness, because it was called the Eddy podcast. And so
yes,
green logo, really cool. Had it done by this graphic designer. And then I had an ex-Marine on. This is like episode 3 or 4, which you can be found in the archives if anybody wants to go back and listen. He's a guy who I went to high school with. We never really, he was just one of those guys you pass in the hallway in high school, and he's always really nice, good guy. He's a real estate agent now in the town that I live in. And, but he was an ex-Marine, and we're just literally, he brought over a 6-pack of beer. We sat my wife was out of town. We sat in the kitchen and we just recorded this podcast while we're just talking, or we recorded this podcast while we're drinking beer and just telling stories. And then I started asking him about, any memories from war, basically. And he starts to talk about lingering symptoms that he's had. He's been out of combat now for 10 years, probably. He starts talking about having intense migraines, and that they really began after he got back, and he was seeing a lot of friends die in Humvee blow-ups and things like that, landmines, stuff like that. And he started to cry. And I was just thinking, like, wow, like, what a powerful moment to have this guy who's this hardened Marine, real estate agent, big boss man around here, talk about long-standing symptoms that really, they shouldn't be happening. There isn't any sort of a diagnosed, he's got some kind of a neck problem or something like that, or cancer, tumors, or whatever. And it started after he got back from combat. Like, to me, that says more maybe than anything. And so I continued recording, and it would get more. Then I talked to Nicole Sachs, had her on. I was just getting way more gratification out of talking about the mind stuff than the fitness stuff. So had Steve Ozanich on the podcast. I'd read his book, and I had him on the show. And then I took a 4-month hiatus when my second daughter was born. Decided to rebrand and call it the Mind and Fitness Podcast. And basically, it was my cop out to say it's mostly going to be about the mind. And if somebody from the fitness world comes on that I think is interesting, it'd be cool to have them.
I love how you put the word mind in front of fitness, right? You didn't put the Fitness and Mind podcast, the Mind podcast.
And the person who did my new logo, I've known her for 20 years, and she, the logo is this. It's a brain lifting a weight. So, like, I just love how it incorporates the two of them. Yeah. But I did. So I started, it was a weekly show. Every Wednesday I relaunched. I found, I'd find like a psychologist or an LCSW to interview. And last year around this time, podcast was getting 600 or so listens in a month, which, it'd be in 10 countries or 15 countries or something. And in the past couple of months, like it's 7,000, 8,000 a month. And yeah, it's getting listened to in almost 90 countries around the world, which is really cool. But I think the cooler part is that I'm getting messages every week from people that, I live in South Korea and I listen to your podcast and I'm having these kinds of issues and it's really helping. There's 93 iTunes reviews of people saying this is helping me get back in the gym. There's a couple of people that review that, they're CrossFit athletes that were completely out of the game, that they said that what I talk about really helped them. It spoke to them a lot. I think the coolest ones, though, there's been a couple of parents that have come to me and said, like there was one, she said her son's 19 or 20 years old, diagnosed with compartment syndrome, which is terrible. Don't ever Google that because I got diagnosed with that once too. Yeah. And she had said that basically he reached out to me maybe 6 months before this and told me that he was a power lifter and he was a collegiate athlete, played basketball, had stopped completely, had this, doesn't know, it came out of nowhere. It was just started spasming, he started spasming in several places, had given it up and I was just talking to him. And then I hadn't heard from him for a few months. And then his mom messaged me out of nowhere and said, I just want to let you know that Brandon's back to full activity and he's pain-free and that you were the only one to talk to him. Like, that you talked to him about the stuff, you told him he understood it. It was a young male talking to a young male about athletics and fitness and how this stuff is interacting and maybe why he's putting himself under the pressure he is and that he's pain-free to this day. And it's like, that's a pretty pivotal message coming from a 50-year-old woman telling me that her son is back to his collegiate sport. Like, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it's so gratifying, isn't it? To know what you're doing is not just, talking about shooting the shit about nothing really, or a lot of podcasts talk about whatever, right. But you're actually helping people around the world with the work that you're doing, which is quite amazing. It really is.
Yeah, and one thing I think about is that the big podcast guys make money off this stuff, and that's their career. They're getting 100,000 downloads a week and that kind of thing, and they have advertisers and all this. My gym has a podcast of their own, and then I've got my podcast, and the podcast that they have, there's, as I listen to it, I'm like, this could be so much better, just based off because I have years in radio before even doing this. Like, I worked in programming at an ESPN station in a top 15 market in the United States for 2 years. I know what goes into this stuff.
You were made for this, Eddie. You got the classic radio voice.
Yeah, right. So, but they've got partnerships with local chiropractor places, and they don't ask me anything about any of this stuff, even though I was mysteriously gone for a year from their gym, and then I'm back, and everybody's asking, members are asking why, what happened, but, the powers that be don't want to give it another 2. And I think it's just because, look, what I'm going to talk about is going to be completely counter to the partnerships you have at these chiropractor places that you're sending people. So.
Yeah, it's a threat, really. Essentially, it can be a threat to, heck, this work can be a threat to the medical establishment, really. And Dr. Sarno was the one to really prove that because obviously he didn't get the recognition he deserved, yet he helped millions of people through his books and thousands of people coming to him. So, there's still more work to be done, but the fact that you're putting your stuff out there is awesome. I think it's an amazing thing, and I'm really happy that it's growing the way it's growing. And so that's great. So I think we'll finish up here because it's been an hour. An hour goes so fast when we're talking. But I think that was great to get your story told, and you kind of went into a bit more detail maybe than you might share on your podcast because you're always asking questions of other people. So really, that's why I wanted to interview you, to kind of get you to just share your side of things and talk. So it was really nice to hear that.
Yeah. And people got to actually see my face.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's his face. So this is great. So thanks so much for coming on here and sharing some of your time and sharing your story and insights. I really appreciate it and hope others get a lot out of this. And it was great talking today, Eddie.
Cool. Thanks, Jim.